Banditos, welcome to another Wednesday episode of the Dollar Bin Bandits on this October 26th. I am Joe Marcello.
I'm Warren Phillips.
I'm Mike Farah.
And it's that time of week again where we bring you awesome interviews with awesome creators. And today we're bringing you our interview with another returning guest. We're talking about none other than Paul Kupperberg.
Yeah, Paul is one of the most underrated writers in comic history, I think, when you look at the scope of books that he's written for all sorts of different titles. And he's back on now. He's got a Kickstarter project coming on where he's interviewing and speaking to other legends in the industry, getting their stories and putting it together. So we have it for the future going forward. And I think that's just a wonderful thing.
Yeah, the project's called Direct Conversations. It's actually a sequel to, I think, an earlier book that he put together with interviews from Bronze Age creators at DC Comics. And so he's, stealing a little bit of our thunder in the interview game here, but we'll allow him to do that. He's really put together an interesting book, had a lot of great conversations with these guys. And so we get to talk to him about all of that. So let's get to it. It's Paul Kupperberg.
So, Paul, thank you so much again for joining us on Dollar Bin Bandits. It's so great to have you back.
Always a pleasure. Well, we'll see.
Oh, well, thank you. And you have a new Kickstarter project going on. What is this all?
Yes, I do. Well, it's for direct comments, talks with fellow DC Comics Bronze Age creators. I just kind of a follow-up to direct comments, which I see right behind you. Those were interviews I did in around 1990, and it really wasn't, it was kind of a generalized thing, and I was doing them to get material for a brief article in DC Direct Current, so they weren't really that deep. For this one, I decided to do, to actually talk to people and engage in an entire conversation. Go figure. I wanted to talk about those early 70s, mid 70s when I broke into comics, and these are other people who broke in with me, and it was a very, it was a unique time. Comic books were in a kind of a shift. The way they were, the people who were doing them, the way they were being sold, and everything was changing. And we were kind of the first generation who were invited into the field. We were fans and letter column hacks and fanzine producers. And, when we knocked on the door at DC, they knew our names, they knew who we were, and they knew we were, devoted fans, and they knew we'd work cheap. So it worked out for everybody. So again, I just wanted to connect with these people and talk to them, tell tales about the good old days, and maybe not some good ones, but it's all the story. And so I spoke with Jack C. Harris, Bob Rozakis, Anthony Tollin, Michael Uslan, Steve Mitchell, Joe Staton, Paul Levitz, Howard Chaykin, Bob Toomey, and Tony Isabella. You probably recognize all but one name on there, the Bob Toomey. Mm-hmm. He was a writer who was in the business for 4 or 5 years, and we started around the same time, and we were very friendly at the time. So he left comics, went into computer and networking stuff and all that, but haven't spoken to him in decades. But I tracked him down, which Facebook, so and got in touch, and it was interesting to talk to him, to get kind of the perspective of a guy who didn't stick around for the next 40 years,
Right.
See what happened with him and what he thought about those times.
How long does a project like this take you from start to finish?
Well, I started the interviews in May.
Okay.
And did the last one. When did I do the last one? I did the last one on the 23rd of August.
Okay.
And since then I've been working on, you're more focused when you're on a podcast, and all that stuff. But when you're just talking with somebody, you kind of ramble and go all over the place. And so just editing the raw transcript is a treat, especially the way the AI translate, transcription program works, you get some really great, great strange words in there. How many ways can you mishear Carmine Infantino? You'd be amazed.
That's a whole nother second book right there.
That's right. That's right.
Now I know you said mentioned before that the last book, a lot of this was these guys sort of wrote down their own information and sort of told their own stories. For this one, for some parts.
Well, it was again, I did these monthly articles, and it was a spotlight on creators of whatever thing we were highlighting that month, because this was in Direct Currents, which was the comic shop giveaway that DC produced in the through the 70s, 80s, and 90s. I wrote 90 some odd of that particular run, and I had written them before and after. But yeah, those were done specifically. So out of the 90 interviews I did over the course of my time on that magazine, I only had the raw transcripts of the about 22 of them.
Okay.
So a lot of them were lost, which is a shame. I wish I'd been able to save them, but this was a 3.5-inch disc,
Right.
floppy disk, that I found in a box, and I happened to have an old floppy drive that still worked, and I was able to retrieve that stuff.
Why is it so important for you to get these stories together to keep these, people's names alive and out there for generations to come?
Well, I was talking to my son earlier and telling him about how the Kickstarter is going and all that, and he said, "Yeah, you're an historian." And I went, "No, I'm just a guy who, puts stuff out on the internet. I just find this stuff fascinating." When I was a kid, there wasn't a lot of information out there. There was the Jules Pfeiffer book. There was a few other things, but really not a lot of information about the history of comics. And I was always hungry for that stuff because I wanted to know, when you pick up an issue of the Flash and you learn that there had been another one before, it's like, because I was a dedicated hardcore fan. I wanted to know how it all worked and how it all fit together. And so I just went from that. And I'm always a bit of a pack rat, and I inherited stuff from my brother, who was an even bigger one. So there's a lot. I run across a lot of little tchotchkes and interesting things from the past, and I'm always putting them up on my website or online, on social media. It's fascinating. Who cares about a 1971 DC Comics production schedule? Well, according to the number of responses on the post, hundreds.
Yes.
So it's valuable stuff. It's history. It is the comics history, and I just like getting it out there, and I like sharing it.
I think your son's absolutely right. You are a historian, because when I read, Back Issue Magazine, how often your name comes up in articles, talking about projects that come on it, or 13th Dimension. And it's, to praise you, but if it wasn't for you and what you're doing, so much of this information would be lost, and people wouldn't, get the recognition that maybe they deserve. Right.
And I know, Back Issue is a great magazine. I love it. I enjoy writing for it. Michael Yore is an old friend from DC Comics, and he's a great guy to work with. It's important, and it happens to be the magazine that covers my era.
Right.
This is when I was in comics. This is the stuff I lived. This stuff.
Right.
It's like, people look back at DC's history and the multiverse and all this stuff, and they're able to look at it, as a whole finished thing.
Right.
Whereas in my life, I was just, seeing piece by piece as it went by. Right. I was picking up the issues going, Starman and Black Canary, wow, So this stuff was all like, I was living that era. And then I was, up at DC in the mid 70s. I was on staff for the DC explosion, followed by the implosion. and then I was off staff because last hired, first fired. Although according to Saul Harrison, you're not being fired, you're being laid off.
Oh, well, it
Yeah,
softens the blow.
yeah, no, it didn't. I said, does that mean I'm not, that still means I don't get paid, right?
Right.
Oh, yeah, okay. But at least I had the opportunity to be fired by Saul frickin' Harrison. Saul frickin' Harrison worked on Famous Funnies #1 on the color separations. He had been there literally since the birth of the modern comic industry in 1935.
Wow.
And, you know, imagine learning from that guy. Imagine, you know, him, even when he yelled at me, which he often did because I was a smart ass and deserved it. But, you know, you learn something.
Right.
You learn, don't do that. But, no, but, you know, and Jack Adler, who was also in there from, you know, from almost day one, you know, just priceless. You know, I came into the business in 1975, which was the industry was 40 years old at the time. You know, so the people who created it were still alive and still working, you know, like you go up to the office and there's this guy who was drawing comics in, you know, there's Irv Novick, you know, who was, you know, drawing comics from day one as well.
Yep.
It's just, you know, Nick Cardy, you know, all these people who had been there forever. Kurt Schaffenberger, who worked on Captain Marvel. You know, Kurt Swan, who was, you know, if you check Kurt's history, he goes back to like 1941. He was ghosting Newsboy Legion.
Right.
Is it Newsboy Legion? Yeah, I think it was Newsboy Legion. Boy Commandos. No, I think he was ghosting Boy Commandos for Simon and Kirby. And you look at that stuff and it's like, that's good. I mean, that's, you know, it's Simon and Kirby. It's good. He really did a great job. But, you know, there's history, you know, sitting next to you at the lunch counter. You know, it was amazing.
Well, let me ask you this, because I know, you know, for that older generation, saying that you worked in comic books wasn't something that you bragged about, maybe in social gatherings and stuff like that. When you worked with these guys, were they open to talking about their past and the history of comics, or were they just sort of focusing on what's coming next?
No, they knew they were safe with us. You know, they could see, you know, they could see the adulation in our eyes. We weren't there to make fun of them, except for Bob Kane. But you know, it's we would truly wanted to hear what they had to say.
Yeah.
We wanted to work with them. I mean, I can't tell you the thrill it is to, you know, draw a story and see it drawn by Kurt Swan or Jesus, Jack Kirby. I got Jack Kirby to, you know, drew a miniseries that I wrote. I mean, you know, where does that come from? How does that happen? So yeah, they were fine. Although I do know, you know, a lot of the, well, they said they were children's book illustrators or things like that.
Right.
Yeah, well, because comic books had, you know, had a bad reputation from the 50s.
I know Mike has a question, but I have to have a quick follow-up just because your last comment. You have to give a Bob Kane story, because I read a lot of things about him. I know he's kind of not everyone's cup of tea.
Bob was a pompous ass. I mean, that really is what it comes down to. He had a gigantic ego. He wrote his own publicity and believed it, you know. He didn't draw. I mean, there's one story, it's probably, you know, it's been around and many people have told it, I'm sure, and different artists have been attributed to it. But Bob Kane brought in a Batman job to Julie Schwartz and turned it in. And, you know, it wasn't by him, it was by Shelley Moldoff, of course, because that's who was drawing the book at the time. But, you know, the fiction was Bob Kane was the author, was the artist of these pages. So he hands it to Julie. Julie looks through it and he gets in, he goes, this hand, Batman's hand, it's awkward, it's wrong, it's bad. Can you fix this? Bob goes, sure, I'll take it back to the studio and, you know, have it. And Julie says, it's a hand, just go into production and, you know, sit at a table and fix it. He goes, he does that, he makes his art correction. He comes back to Julie. Julie goes, that's worse than it was before. Just fix it. He goes back a second time and fumbles it. and he comes back the third time. I've heard it was Murphy Anderson. Murphy took pity on him and said, I'll do that for you, Bob. And he, did it, and goes back to Julie's office with it and goes, here it is. I hope this works. And Julie, couldn't you do that the first time? Because he's not Murphy Anderson.
Exactly.
But that was the kind of guy he was. And my first exposure to him was at the 1971 New York Comic Con, the ones put on by Phil Suling, and he was a guest, and he was walking around. He had this young woman in, and remember it's 1971, so she's wearing like this I don't even know how
halter
to
top.
explain it. No, it's but it's a whole suit. It's a spangled, like it's.
Yeah.
I remember it as being like spangly and low cut and probably for hire. But he's walking around. You met my girlfriend. It was just obnoxious. I was 16 years old, and about a month or two later, I was a member of an APA called NIAPA. A Kappa Alpha, excuse me. The first, the I don't know if you're familiar with comic book APAs, but they were you kids.
Sorry,
they were publication every month. You joined a group. Usually they cap it at 50, but you joined a group, and every month, or you were supposed to contribute a certain number of pages per year to the APA. So every month you would prepare your piece, make 50 copies of it, and send it to a guy called a central mailer. Central mailer would take one of each and turn it into this month's Kappa Alpha, and mail it back to all the participants. So it was the social network of the day, and it was in Mimeo and Ditto. It was glorious. But a friend, the cover of his contribution that month was this really obnoxious sketch of Kane sitting on the table at his panel, with his gorgeous girlfriend, and saying all kinds of inane things, which I believe were verbatim. He took them from that. And it was, this issue, Bob the Putz Kane. And from that day on, I cannot think his name without including the Putz.
That works.
Yeah.
Stanley would be proud of the nickname, I guess. Or maybe not.
Yeah, I'm sure Stan met Bob, and I can't see how he could think anything other than what everybody thought. But.
So, Paul, the new book, obviously, with the 10 people that you collected, are going over a lot of the same period of time, right? Which was kind of the point.
Sure.
And I was wondering, and I don't know if you have an example of this, if there is an event or a piece of that period of time where everybody sort of remembered things exactly the same.
No, I didn't run it. I was hoping I'd get some kind of Rashomon thing going on in there, between a few people. But no, we didn't get to the same. There weren't a lot of rehashed stories, which is great. But that would have been fun, but didn't happen.
Interesting. Because my follow-up to that was there one thing that everybody remembered differently, and you guys were like, wait a second, this was totally different, but it sounded like there was just not a lot of overlap.
Well, it's strange. I went into each interview, the first few at least, with a very definite plan in mind. Here's where I want to go, here's where I want to talk about, here's what I'd like to cover. And within 10 minutes it was just like, you're done. And it was just talking. And, I thought that, like, Paul Levitz and I would spend the time talking about those early days with our fanzines and things like that. But Paul, jumped into the whole business side of things and started talking about when he was taking over, the business, this 20-year-old taking over the business from these Warner executives, and, trying to make sense of what they've been doing all these years. So, great, better than what I was going to talk about. This is stuff you just don't hear about a lot.
Is there a name, whether in your books or just somebody you work with, that fans should know that just isn't out there like it should be?
Well, unfortunately, I think certainly pre 1990,
Mhm.
I don't think there's an acknowledgement that there really were many comic books. They don't. Everything has changed so much, so often
Mhm.
in the business that like even DC when they do these 80th anniversary hardcovers,
Mhm.
if you look at it, it's a nod to the past, and then 2000 on. Yeah. So there's really not a lot. I mean, there's a lot of stuff DC could reprint
Mhm.
that I think would be, well, I don't, again, I don't know. I'm sure they do market research. I'm sure they have, stuff going on, but it seems to me, even if you just use random sampling of Facebook and Twitter people who go, I'd love to see, like, for instance, I wrote with Paul and Joe Staton, drew it with Showcase 100,
Mhm.
which is, I must have signed thousands of copies of that in my career. I mean, just every convention, I get a bunch of them. It's one of the, and it's a fun little comic book. I refer to it as crisis done in one and nobody had to die. So, but you know, that's never been reprinted.
Mhm.
That was 1978, 79. There must have been space somewhere to reprint that, or even do it as a what are they doing, the replicas now, or the
Uh, though, like the $1 comics
well,
where it just
I think
reprints.
they're 3.95 now, but they do facsimile editions of
Yeah.
a lot of it.
Right.
Mhm.
So I think they just did the Marvel family um #1. But anyway, something like that. But it baffles me what doesn't get reprinted, as much as some of what does get reprinted. But I have long acknowledged that I am no longer the audience for modern comics. You know, I am I am I'm old. So that puts me out. What, we don't care. Oh, he's got money to spend. Doesn't matter. He's old.
I mean, I don't think we're the audience anymore for modern comics.
He probably, yeah. I mean, I love comic books. I love the silly shit I grew up on,
Mhm.
but I can't take it. That's even when I was writing it, I couldn't take it that seriously. I mean, I see people, their emotional, well-being rests on fictional characters.
Mhm.
Um, I, I, I don't know.
Yeah. I
Yeah.
agree.
Yeah. I wanted to ask again about sort of the diversity of creators that you had
Mhm.
in this book, and they come from different perspectives because they had different positions within the industry.
Right.
I was wondering if you found that, I don't know, inkers talked about or had a similar viewpoint versus pencilers versus writers. Were there sort of like groupings that sort of at all
No, no,
emerged?
it's these are these are guys who have had long careers, long diverse careers. And like Howard Chaykin, talks about his feelings about comics. He feels it's ridiculous that grown men, are so wrapped up in these characters created for children.
Mhm.
And you can't disagree with that. Well, you can, but you'd be wrong. Um, but it everybody has their own point of view, and frankly, we were less about what comics were out there than the experiences inside the industry. Speaking of inkers, Steve Mitchell, I've got some quotes if I may do dramatic readings.
Please.
Here we go. Speaking of Sal Harrison and deadlines, as we were, I was there the day Neil brought the very late pencil pages for the Superman versus Muhammad Ali tabloid. A bunch of us were in one of the artist bullpen areas, and Sal was going through the pages one by one, just flipping them over and not saying a word. Finally, he gets to the last page and he turns to Neil and says in that dry nasal way of his, "You know, Adams, it's the best thing you've ever done and not worth the wait." Now, there were
Bravo.
5 people in the room, right? And you know, now we hear that. We get that story. He tells another one about Joe Kubert and Neil Adams. Essentially, Neil brings in wait, let me find it. Here we go. One day, Neil comes in with a drawing he's done of Tarzan to sort of prove to Joe Kubert that, well, he could do that too. Neil and Joe were very competitive. Neil would probably be the first one to admit that Joe was great, and I think Joe would admit that Neil was great. But I think Neil was always trying to play on Joe's level. Neil was super talented, but not a great storyteller. Joe was probably one of the top 5 storytellers in comics history. He once told me that good storytelling was if you could follow the story without reading the word balloons. So Joe looks at Neil's drawing and asks if he can borrow it. He takes it back to his office, puts a piece of tracing paper over it, and with a red marker starts outlining changes. Neil made Tarzan very buff, very muscular, but Joe drew him as lean and athletic with more of a swimmer's build. Joe's marking up Neil's pencils on the overlay, not being snide or nasty, just showing Joe how Joe saw Tarzan. And Neil just had to grin and bear it. Neil was always looking for a fight because he always thought he was right. And a lot of times he was. As far as I'm concerned, Neil is right up there on the Mount Rushmore alongside Joe. But I always got the feeling that he might have thought Kubert was just maybe a little bit better than him.
Yeah.
But, you know, like that's, you know, and if you knew Kubert, you know, you believe absolutely there was no malice in this. He wasn't being, you know, a jerk about it. He was just going, interesting. Here's what I think, you know.
Right.
But, you know, stuff like that, you know, they're guys who experience things, you know, that, like I say, there's 6 people in the room to see it. And, you know, several of them are dead now.
Right.
So, you know, and that was really the final push was, you know, I started thinking about it as a maybe, you know, a project maybe I could do this, you know, and I started making a list of who I want to talk to. And, you know, in my head, the first bunch of people who popped up were dead. You know, I would have killed to have Marty Pasco in this book. You know, because Marty could talk. But, you know, man, he had the stories and he had the knowledge, you know. So, you know, I realized that there were people I want to talk to that, well, you know, I'm 67 and on Social Security. What am I waiting for?
Just based on what you were saying, we live in a day and age now with social media where you have 20-year-olds telling the world how Steve Ditko felt about working with Stan Lee on Spider-Man, and people are taking it as the gospel truth. How
Right.
important is it for you to get the stories from, like you said, the people who were in the room, who witnessed it, who lived through it, and to get it down on paper so these documents can say, no, this is what happened?
Yeah, it very. You know, I see. You know, I've learned to restrain myself and not, you know, and not respond to every wrong story I see on the internet. Otherwise, I never get anything else done. But you know, the problem when I was a boy, when I was a kid in the 60s, DC had a weekly tour. You could go up to the offices and be taken on a tour by Sal Harrison or a couple other guys from production department. And as you walked out at the end, after, you know, looking over Neil Adams' shoulder while he was at his drawing board, or Murphy, Neil and Murphy both like to be in the office. I think they like to get away to a place, but they both came in with shirts and ties and jackets, you know. So, you know, that was as close to inside as we got into comics. You know, we got this superficial look, although they did hand you a piece of original art on the way out. Yeah. Well, otherwise they were cutting it up and incinerating it.
Yes.
Yeah. So, then as things progressed, fanzines started coming along and all it kind of opened the business. And, it kind of takes some of the mystique out of it. I mean, when you know how the sausage is made, that old saw. But it's true. I hear more debate about how the comics are made than about the comics themselves. So, I don't, I love some good gossip, but at least I know these people, some of these people, and and can enjoy it. But no, but look, these guys like Steve Ditko was a hermit.
Mhm.
He wasn't a hermit. He was a private individual. Steve Mitchell tells another story where he's going in to see some Dirty Harry movie on 53rd Street or whatever in New York, and he runs into Steve going to the same movie. So they go in together and they sit together and don't say a word. They watch the movie,
Mhm.
and he comes out afterwards. Oh, how did you like it, Steve? And it's like the hero didn't save the day. It wasn't a good movie.
Mhm.
The police came in and saved everybody, not the hero. So, but here he's just going to afternoon at the movies, and he's story man is working.
Right.
But yeah, he was he had his friends, he had his so he. But again, you will always see that he was a hermit.
Mhm.
He was just a very private individual.
I say I
Go ahead, Oren.
I just say another video coming up soon, but I also spoke to Jack Harris a couple of weeks ago, and he was talking to me about Steve Ditko too, and how there's so many misconceptions about him. He was just someone who just liked doing his own thing. He liked movies, like you said. He liked writing, and he just liked doing his own stuff. And he wasn't what people paint him out to be.
And he was a guy who didn't have to take any bullshit because he didn't care.
Right.
Like, Stan's not treating me right, hasta la vista.
Yeah.
Gone. He's out of there. He walks off of Spider-Man, because it's wrong to him. Well, that's the guy. He didn't like doing superheroes particularly. I think I mean, he hasn't done them since.
Right.
But I don't know. I met him a couple of times. He was always very, nice and professional, and no stories about him.
It's all too easy to reduce folks, especially folks that are more private, to caricatures. Like they're hermetic, and they're not social, and so therefore that's the story instead of their work, which is unfortunate.
I was looking at something. I think I was a 13th Dimension column about Ditko's. Oh no, it was Coletta. Never mind. It was Vinnie. I did a thing on Vinnie Coletta's birthday, and I looked up his Mike's comic book database. All his credits, and it's hundreds of them, and that they only included one Charlton Comics story in there. So it's like, they're off by at least 30 or 40% of his output, which was impressive to begin with. It just, I don't think they were any different than the only difference between those guys and going forward from my generation of creators was that most of them felt it was a job. They were just doing a job. They could have been going to an insurance company. They had their times where they worked, and that was it. Normal people going home to the suburbs or working in the suburbs where they lived, and just living their lives. They when comic book conventions first came around, it was mainly Marvel guys who showed up, because Stan was beginning to have that inkling that there was something about about the fandom, that they could serve a purpose. Whereas the DC in the 60s, they were kind of like, well, they were writing letters and and supporting us, but they didn't believe that there could be a fandom. I think to them the readership was 8 to 13 years old. That's who they were doing comic books for. You read that stuff. Schwartz was an exception. His books were always more I'm not going to say mature, but less juvenile. His science fiction, even his westerns, they were just slightly elevated from the stupid superhero fare. Because again, Batman fighting aliens and Superman fighting guys in suits, something was fundamentally wrong.
And they're always that age group is always turning over. I imagine that's what they were thinking too, is that you're always going to have 18 to 13-year-olds, but those previous 8 to 13-year-olds are not going to continue or not going to be interested in
if you
those.
look at the early 80-page Giants, which started in 1960, if you check what they reprint, most of it was from no more than 4 or 5 years before, because they figured either the kids who read it originally wouldn't remember it,
right,
or most of the readers picking up the annual weren't reading comics back then,
right?
5 years ago, and they wouldn't be again in 3 years. That was really the firm belief.
Yeah, and one of the questions I wanted to ask you about is how you describe this period of time that you and your interviewees were working in as being sort of this new kind of a new era, or at least on the cusp of a new era, when fandom was starting to creep in and take off. The audiences were changing, new blood was coming in. So I would sort of describe it as kind of like one of those revolutionary periods. Was that your sense going through it?
Yeah, well, I kind of went into it with the idea that the previous generation was looking at us as those little bastards who come to take our jobs. But I don't think it really was that way. I mean, they were, for the large part, too nice to us to for that to have been true. Michael Uslan's take on it, when I told him that theory, was that he feels that we were the first generation invited in to the industry to be taught. He got hired under the junior woodchuck. Well, he was hired for something else, but they were hiring all these guys in the early 70s, from fandom. They were, Rizakis and Uslan and Marty Pasco and Paul Levitz. All these guys were coming in because they knew, I don't think they thought about the older guys aging out all that as much, but they also knew that the market was expanding. Suddenly you had the dollar comics and the larger 25-cent comics that needed all this extra material, and it wasn't, who are you going to get to write into a crypto, a crypto feature for Zootman Family? You're not going to ask, you're not going to ask Gardner Fox to do that. You're going to get some new guy who, is just learning and breaking himself in. It was a valuable time. There were so many anthologies that there was always a 6 or 8 pager to write, or a 10 pager. And, they were great learning tools. You learn how to construct a story in, a very tight and concise way when all you're doing are 6 and 8 pages. It was a year or more before I got to do a book length story. So, it was great training.
Now this, as a follow-up, this may be maybe a more painful memory, but do you remember, or could you mark in time as you were there when you felt like the next revolution was coming along, like when you and your cadre had become sort of the old timers, and then there was a whole new wave?
Yeah, it happened in the 90s when I was an editor up there, because I was calling a lot of my friends and the old guys that I wanted to work, that's we're still working, and wanted to work with them, but I was also hiring new people. I hired Ethan Van Sciver. I'm sorry. I hired him for Impulse. Look, he was a nice kid. He came in with his wife and his baby in the stroller, and he was always polite and nice, who knows what happens to people? But yeah, a lot of people. I turned down Dean Haspel. He applied to be my assistant editor, and I turned him down. I said, I think you really want to be an artist. Why don't you go do that? So he thanked me for that. But yeah, they were coming in and I was getting less writing. I mean, part of it had to do with being on staff. But part of it was just, there was Jeff Johns coming along. They didn't need me.
Mm-hmm.
They thought.
Yeah.
Little did they know. You also describe in the Kickstarter why this is all DC or primarily DC.
So what I know.
It's what you know.
Yeah, I worked at DC. I read Marvels as a kid, but I started reading comic books before Marvel existed. I was reading comics when I was 4 years old in 1959. I was looking. There was a bookstore around the corner and up the block from our place in Brooklyn, and Dave Solomon's bookstore. And Dave sold coverless comics, 2 for a dime or 2 for a nickel, whatever it was. And my father went into, to buy books. And if we were along, we'd pick up a bunch, a few coverless comics. And I fell in love with the Wonder Woman comic of that day, the Robert Kanigher, Andrew and Esposito run. It was great stuff. I mean, for the time, for a 4 or 5 or 6 year old, Kanigher had turned it from a superhero comic into kind of a little girl's comic. It was a lot of genies and dragons and Merboy and Bird Boy, and that's where we got Wonder Girl and Wonder Tot. So it was ridiculous stuff, but most comic book stories were in 1960, and it just appealed to me, and then I discovered Superman. There was a TV show that we watched just before going to sleep. It was on at 7:00, and it was Claude Kirshner's Circus. I think Channel 9 in New York, and he ran cartoons, and he would often run Superman, the Fleischer Superman cartoons. So I would, go to sleep dreaming about these characters, and then one day, we're in the candy store around the corner, and wait, that's the same guy as, but it was in color, because all we had then was a 17-inch Philco. A nice wood cabinet, though. It was a nice little piece. But and that was it. I was just like, I was hooked, and then came Flash 123, the Flash of Two Worlds, where it was discovered that the multiverse was invented on my birthday, because when Flash runs over the bridge into Keystone City, picks up the newspaper, and the date on it is June 14th, 1961, and my birthday is June 14th. So it was like, all right, okay, I got to see what's happening here. I didn't read that story until probably 64 or 65 in a Flash annual, but it was still all new to me. So
you're one of those focal points in the world where the multiverse can blossom.
Yes,
I suppose.
I was going to say I can fart the multiverse, but I didn't want to.
I'm sure you can, but yes,
I
you're in
but
polite company.
yeah.
Though.
I don't think yeah, no, I just fell in love with the concept and with the characters, and everything DC did, because that kind of pointed me towards Schwartz stuff. And I noticed that the books with his name in it were the better comic books. Carmen Infantino was the first artist I could recognize, with just by seeing a piece of art. It was just very heavily imprinted on me. I would, I had a, not the happiest of childhood. So, I did do a lot of escaping into this stuff, and, started writing and drawing my own. And, just there didn't ever seem to be a doubt that I would be doing this. I mean, I didn't know how, or even if or even if people did, like, how do you do that? How do you, eventually we stumbled our way into it, but yeah.
Well, now having done two, successful books with DC folks, interviewing DC folks at that time. Do you have any kind of impulse to maybe start thinking about expanding into like strangers that worked at the competition, folks that were around at the same time, but were obviously at Marvel or somewhere else?
I actually froze and didn't hear the first part of that question.
Okay, well, we'll edit that.
Okay.
And then
So-
I said, having done, 2 rounds of interviews with primarily DC creators and, really getting deep into that time period of which you worked, is there any impulse to look at the other side, even if they are sort of strangers, to see what was going on at that time in their heads at Marvel?
No, I really haven't. I don't know what went on up there. I don't know, I mean, I went up occasionally. I had friends who worked there, so, I would see them. The only work I ever did for Marvel in my entire career was a truly awful Captain America fill-in that was drawn by my brother, which didn't help. And then I did a few years of Crazy Magazine, writing movie parodies and
Right.
stuff like that. And then around 1990, I did 1 issue of Savage Sword of Conan. That's my entire Marvel output. In fact, I was at a convention, I don't remember how long ago, but it was the last convention Herb Trimpe went to, and he died the following Monday. I had never met Herb before. I'm a big fan of his growing up. I loved his Phantom Eagle. I thought that was just one of the coolest strips Marvel ever did. You remember that?
Oh,
Yeah.
yeah.
And his Hulk, all this stuff. I liked his art. But that convention happened to it was heavy on Marvel guests. And at the con party, I was sitting at a table and I'm with all these Marvel people I, never met before. I knew everybody's name and they knew who I was, but our paths never crossed. And that was really my first deep exposure to Marvel. And by the end of the evening, after hearing about all the hijinks and stuff, I said, so that's why you guys could never ship a book on time, right? But but no, I don't have a frame of reference for them for the for the office and the culture. I don't know. I've heard some bits and pieces about John Verporten, but I don't have a sense of the man other than he was ginormous. He was very loomy, but yeah, so I don't know these people, so I don't really have a sense of that. I'm thinking of, if I do another one, it might be something like, I'll sit down and talk to writers about writing in that period. I think that could be an interesting, love to have a chance to have an extended conversation with Jerry Conway or guys like that. So, we'll see. See how this one goes, and there's a couple other projects I've been wanting to get, on the way. So we'll see. But yeah, I'll almost definitely be doing more of the interview kind of thing. It's interesting. Yeah.
Well, that's good news to hear right there. I just want to talk about you for a second. And
why me?
You've written a few books in your life, I heard.
Yeah.
But are there any projects that either you worked on or some of these folks in the book that you worked on that you think are sort of unsung, that either miniseries or stories that you think fans should really take another look at and sort of rediscover?
I'm not my biggest fan, especially of my earlier stuff. So, and thinking, I'm trying to think, most of the stuff I worked on has been pretty, the larger things, the Doom Patrol and Checkmate and Life with Archie and that stuff. Even one of my favorite things I ever did was the Phantom Stranger miniseries that Mike Mignola and P. Craig Russell did. And it was just a gorgeous piece of work. And for once, I wrote these 4 scripts and I went, oh, okay, those don't suck, and so but that's I get a lot of appreciation for that. It's so you know I really can't think of anything. It's maybe Arion, Lord of Atlantis. I think that might have although pick that up in the what do I know? Although there was internet rumors that James Gunn is looking at Checkmate for his next project. So no idea if it's true. It's too good to be true, so it's probably not. But he seems to want to focus on Amanda Waller and all that stuff. So we'll see. I would not be displeased.
No.
We'll cross our fingers for you. In fact, we just talked to, although this episode will come out before his, Pete Craig Russell, who brought up the Phantom Stranger miniseries as well. So
cool.
It seems to be a touch point of our recent interviews.
Yeah. Well, I think it was his first. Well, it was Mike's first DC work because Mike Carlin had been originally Denny. I had pitched the miniseries to Denny O'Neil, and he bought it, but then he took over the Batman books, I think, and so it got shifted over to Carlin, who called his old Marvel buddy Mike Mignola to do it. So that worked out.
Turned out pretty well.
There you go. Yeah, serendipity. I also had a question, a career question, because I wasn't on your first episode, and it's hard to pick out pieces from such a long and storied career. But I was interested in the world of Krypton, which it seems to be billed, at least in our research, as the first comic book miniseries.
The first intentional comic book miniseries.
Okay.
Thanks to Carmine Infantino in the 60s and early 70s, there were many miniseries, but it's just because he kept... it was the first one. It was originally written as an arc for the Revived Showcase title. It was supposed to be Showcase, I think, 104 to 106.
And so what went into the decision to make it a miniseries?
Showcase got canceled, so there was no place to run it, and they stuck it in the drawer. And then they stuck it in the drawer originally because the Superman movie got pushed back. They were going to publish it in conjunction with the Superman movie. And when it kept getting pushed back, so Showcase got canceled, it got stuck in a drawer. And when the movie finally did, come to fruition, they didn't really have a lot of material because they weren't legally allowed to do anything based on the Puzo screenplay because that was in litigation or something. Right. And so somebody remembered they had this in the drawer, and they whipped it out, and it wasn't called a miniseries, but it was marketed. The house ad was these 3 issues tell the whole story of blah blah blah. So it was indeed. And I also did the 3rd, which was the Secrets of the Legion of the Superheroes.
And did you guys know? I mean, that was again, you sort of say somewhat unintentional, or it didn't have a home, so you had to publish it as a miniseries. Did you know that was going to gain traction as a format?
I don't think anybody thought much of it. Although I guess once it went out and did well enough, because you get fall off after number 1 sell, and then you have fall off, and if you're only doing 3 issues, you can't really afford a lot of fall off. The only reason that was originally put out was to tie in with the Superman movie, which I'm sure helped. But the second one I think was the Legend of the Batman. That might have been the second mini. I don't remember, but and then the Legion came along, and then they became pretty, a pretty routine thing. I don't think anybody thinking of formats or anything. It was just like, that's what you need. That's what you needed to do at the moment. There's also a lot of stories in the book where guys say they pitched it like here. Denny O'Neil, kept losing artists for the Shadow. He originally had Wrightson, but Wrightson was stuck doing Swamp Thing, and he couldn't do both books. And then had Steranko, but Steranko was Steranko, so he didn't do the book. And then he had somebody else, and then they couldn't do the book. And so he's like he's in the coffee room at DC, and he's lamenting, what the hell am I going to do? And Mike Kaluta is sitting there and goes, can I draw the book? And so Denny ran down the hall to Carmine, came back 5 minutes later and go, you're drawing the book. That doesn't happen anymore. You know, there are stories, you know, where Mike Uslan goes to Sal Harrison and says, you know, the DC Bullet's pretty lame. Can I redesign it? Yeah, sure, go ahead. You know, the last I was there for the Swirl redesign.
Yes.
Yeah. And you know, I don't know how much money was spent on that, but it was more than, you know, the assistant guy going, mind if I take a crack at it? Yeah, so it was a different time. You could literally stick your head in the publisher's door and say, how about this? And you get a go ahead. You know, when I was pitching series, either an editor or a writer, you had to go through, you know, a whole formal proposal, which the editor usually made you rewrite 3 times because they were chicken shit and not willing to stand behind ideas. But still, you know, and then you turned it in, you know, you had to go through this review process through, you know, 3 senior editors and you know, a publisher and a president and a partridge in the pear tree. And, you know, they were willing to take chances in then, you know, in the 60s and late 60s and early 70s. You know, there were comics like Angel and the Ape and The Secret Six. I mean, The Secret Six, like, you know, that was out of left field. It was a great book, E. Nelson Bridwell and Frank Springer, but, you know, it was so not a DC book. But they threw it out there. They tried it. They took a chance. You know, the Levitz's Stalker with Steve Ditko. You know, another thing. It's like, yeah, sure, what the hell, you know, we'll see if it works. And then again, they the reason there were 4 issues. I heard Paul tell this story. The reason there were 4 issues of the Stalker instead of only 3 was that the Sal's secretary made a mistake typing the production schedule, and rather than have her redo it, Sal said they'd do a 4th issue. You know, like, man, that's great stuff. That, you know, can you imagine operating in a world like that?
Pretty cool.
That world has sailed away from us,
Yeah.
I believe.
I mean, you know, it has to at some point. You know, DC spent 45 years as a mom and pop shop. When I started, when most of us started, there were 35 people on staff. You know, when I left DC in 2006, there were 350. There were almost 30 vice presidents alone. You know, it was like, that's how much it had changed.
Yeah. Well, Paul, it's been a great pleasure talking to you. And this episode is probably going up on the last day of your Kickstarter. So I wanted to give you, or we wanted to give you, sort of the last word on pitching people out there for getting this book. You know, it's already you've already met your goals.
Yep,
but
I'm just under 125%, so I'm a happy camper.
I'm sure you are, but I'm sure anything more would be gravy. So
it is.
What's your last minute pitch to those that are listening to this episode right before the deadline?
Well, you know, it's like a line I've used in the Kickstarter. It's like listening to a couple of old pros talking about comics over lunch at a convention.
I'd buy it. In fact, I have. So
thank you very much. I appreciate it. I do appreciate it. I'm you know, I'm glad that people are interested in this, in the same stuff, and are responding to the book. You know, it'll still be on sale after the Kickstarter is over. Of course, it'll be up on Amazon.com, and you know, you can get copies through me, signed and personalized. And if I may, speaking of my books, there's this one which I published recently, The Devil and Leo Persky. And Leo Persky is a reporter for the World Weekly News, which is, you know, a slight reverse of the Weekly World News, where I was an editor and writer for a while. And it's a book of humorous supernatural and science fiction stories about Leo and his relationship with that great metropolitan newspaper that is the world's only reliable news. So you know, you can check that out on what do you call it, Amazon, or again, find me and I'll sell you a copy.
Well, sounds
But
like,
it's just, it's not comic book related. So, people don't, not as many people have seen it as I would have hoped. So,
well, this is the right season for supernatural
well, that's true too. Yeah.
material. So,
And we are back. So, guys, this was a great interview. I'm sorry I couldn't be a part of it. But this is a great project that Paul has going on. And look, like you said, we are the ones to do the interviews, but look, I'll let it slide. It's cool. I mean, he is one of our earliest guests, and he gets a pass.
Yes, Paul is one of the good guys in the comic industry. He's been a big supporter of us, and we're happy to support him with this project. It's already been backed, so there is still time for you guys to get involved, to order your copy. I know I'm going to do so. I can't wait to read it.
if you don't, it'll be on Amazon. Please try to make the Kickstarter. But again, you'll have opportunities to buy it again. And he will sign every book. That was his promise to us. So I know he'll keep his promise. Paul Kupperberg is a stand-up guy. And this is a stand-up podcast. And we're going to say adios to you guys. Thank you for listening. Please remember to rate, review, and subscribe. And we'll see you next time.